Um, while everyone gets a seat, I just want to make a couple of announcements. We have tonight, so after this keynote ends, you're all welcome to go downstairs at the bar. The cash bar will be open. We will do a small ceremony around 7 to give an award, the Juice Award. We have a competition this year for the second year. We run a competition starts in September where you can submit your plugin or your application made with Juice and tell all your friends to vote for you. The competition ended last Friday, so we have we have an award to give. Also, we have another award for the winner of a Juice hackathon organized by the University of West England. So we'll do the two at the same time around 7. It will last 20 minutes, and then we can continue to have. There will be food downstairs, and socializing can continue around 9 p.m. Right, so now it's a great honor to introduce Marina Bosi, who did her PhD at IRCAM in France, and she in a very flattering way compared her career to mine, and I think it's very, well, just because she went to academia and then to industry, which is the same that I did. But the comparison stops here, and I hope that would have a career as good as yours. Marina went on to work at Dolby at DigiDesign first as the 4th employee before the Avid acquisition, then at Dolby, and then led as a CTO the Ampeg LA group that made over 1,000 patents about audio encoding and decoding, which completely changed the way we consume audio, stream audio or MP3, and all the way to smart speakers today. Now she's a consulting professor at CCRMA, the historical center where John Chowning invented frequency model synthesis, and is still a very active center. So please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, JB, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here tonight and honored to be part of this group. I feel the energy, and we're all audio enthusiasts, so I'm really happy. Yes, as JB was describing a little bit my career path, I started in academia, and actually after my thesis, I worked briefly for a composer, Luciano Berio, in Florence. And at the time, he was trying to, together with Renzo Piano, the architect, was trying to restructure this huge building that belonged to Fiat and to make a metamorphosis into a media performance space. So what he wanted to move the sound around and asked for my help from the technical point of view, which I was more than happy to provide. But I told him, look, I really need to go to Stanford and work with John Chowning. At the time, he was working on a piece called Turinazon for loudspeakers moving the sound around, and understand exactly what he did so that I came back and really help you. That was about 30 years ago, in 1988, and that was, I thought, for 6 months. Little did I know that I never would go back to Italy. And so one thing after the other, once I found myself in Silicon Valley, I was like, well, wait a minute, this is where everything, more or less, everything is happening. And I couldn't pass the opportunity to try my hand in the industry. I mean, we love academia. We try all kinds of different things, all kinds of crazy theoretical concepts. But at the same time, one of the comments that my advisor presented to me kind of made me pause and think, and saying, like, you know, your work is important to you, but if you stop working today, no one will realize that you stopped. While if the trash people are stopping today, it's going to be complete chaos. So I felt that I was missing, actually, the reality connection, reality check. And that's why it was so important to me when I first went to CCRMA to also kind of put my toes into the industry. At the time, and we're talking 1988, there was very little done in digital audio. I mean, part of it was because there were specific constraints. Computer power, storage, transmission. When we're talking about not even history, prehistory. We're talking about Stone Age here. I mean, at the time I was working with a modem of 9.6 kilobit per second. Now we have an average of 20 megabits per second, right? 200 times faster. My computer storage was 20 megabytes, and my boss had 40, and I was so envious. And of course, I mean, this is ridiculous, right? So it was clear that as an industry, as an audio industry, we could not advance unless we addressed the fact that we needed, either astronomical capacity, which was not available at the time, wide channels just for audio. We could not transmit, for example, CD. So it was clear that that was the route we were going. Although I started working in perceptual audio coding 30 years ago, I didn't know that I was working in perceptual audio coding because I was really a DSP engineer at DigiDesign, employee number 5. And I was asked to do all kinds of plugins, more or less what you guys are doing, if I understand it correctly. And one of the things that my boss asked me to do at some point was to do data compression. And I had that moment like, why me? I didn't really want to do it until I realized what was involved with audio coding, which was really the kind of the crossroad of many different technologies, if you wish, theory, et cetera, et cetera. So we're talking about digital representation of sound. So the DSP at the time was making like giant leaps. So we were just at the right time. We were about to have kind of an increase in both computer power and transmission channels. Again, lucky me. Psychoacoustically, there was a body of work that was done in Germany by namely Zwicker and his student at the time, Fasto, that really provided us for the basis of understanding how we perceive sound. So we need to represent, we need to also understand how we are perceiving the sound, so we're coding the audio signal in a smart way. So all that kind of led me to what became my career path. But what I would like to talk today is how did we get from this at the end of the 80s, a bunch of CDs. How many of you know what a CD is? Thank you. Sometimes with my students, I ask this question, and I don't see many hands up, but they're all like MP3 based, and worse than that. They come to me with a huge library. By the end of the class, they take with me, they throw it away completely because now they understand what are, not the limitation, because it's not a question of limitation, what are the weaknesses and how to use them to your advantage. In other words, you can correct that. But so how do we get from a stack of CD to actually listening, through streaming or, whatever is your medium for consuming audio? And the idea is actually not, the idea behind all this is not that complex. Basically, what we're doing is we are not allocating resources, in this particular case, bits, to sounds we cannot hear, as simple as that. So if we're looking at, for example, at the CD format, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that, we're talking about 16-bit precision for each audio samples. So we're quantizing the amplitude from the continuous in nature to discrete. And also we're taking snapshots in time, specifically every 0.023 milliseconds. The sampling rate of the CD is 44.1 kilohertz. My question is that really necessary? That's kind of the standard for high quality audio, but we can be smarter than that. We can be more clever. So one thing we're saying, okay, we're looking at the hearing mechanism. We have all this data from Zwicker and the psychoacoustic modeling that has done and studied, and we have a variety of resources. So how can we use that in such a way that comes to our advantage? First of all, let's kind of agree on what we cannot hear. And we cannot really hear very well at high frequencies and at low frequencies. We're extremely, extremely sensitive in the mid-range frequencies, namely in between the 2 and 5 kilohertz. Our sensitivity is very, very extreme. So if we're looking at the data, for example, collected by Zwicker here, what do we have? How do we translate that into this graph? First of all, the x-axis here is the frequency in a log scale in between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz, right? And the y-axis here has the SPL, sound pressure level, in dB. So we have a reference level, which is P0, which is on the order of 10 to the minus 5 pascals. So it's very, very small. So this is the line of the P0 here. And as you can see, we don't perceive all the frequencies at the same way. We're very, very sensitive in between 2 and 5 kilohertz here. We go below the sound pressure level P0. And we're not so sensitive at low frequencies, like, let's say, below 100 hertz, or, for that matter, above 15 kilohertz. It kind of almost goes down vertically on that side. So if we were to apply straight PCM, pulse code modulation, which is what's done in the CD, we would apply a number of bits that are completely useless here. While we need probably more than 16 bits in this region, we don't need very much in this region because chances are that the quantization noise is going to be below the hearing threshold. Okay, fine. So is this the whole story? No. It's not the whole story because there are other things that come into play. There are other things that we cannot hear because something which is louder, which is played at the same time, may basically either partially masking or completely masking the sound. For example, here I'm talking to JB, and all of a sudden I have a loud track coming, and the loud track completely masks our conversation, so we cannot hear each other. So what happens that, again, if we're looking at the data from Zucker, so here, oops. I think I pushed the wrong button. Sorry. Oh, never mind. Now we know what it works, how it works, and we weren't sure. Don't touch it. All right, so here I'm zooming in between 500 hertz and 4,000 hertz. And what you see here lower is the same hearing threshold I showed you before. But what we have here, we have the presence of another loud sound with an SPL at about 60 dB, and the center frequency about 1 kilohertz, right? And that works like as a potential masker because what happens in the spectral proximity of the sound here, the hearing threshold goes up. So we can hear less and less. So if we had a sound in this region before the 1 kilohertz sound, we could hear it if it was, for example, 20 dB. But then in the presence of the louder sound, we cannot hear it anymore because the threshold went up, right? So that's completely masked by the masker. So that's kind of the idea. This is what we call frequency masking or simultaneous masking. There are other phenomena also that come into place related to the time domain masking. In other words, and this is counterintuitive, it took me a while to kind of digest it. We can have some masking before the onset of the signal. So it ramps up in an exponential way, and after the signal is shut down. Typically in perceptual audio coder, we just take snapshots in time and frequencies. We don't do the ramp up or the decay just because we are presenting the signal in the frequency domain with block transforms, so we don't have enough time resolution to do that. But if you want the whole picture, this is not just going up like all of a sudden. It kind of builds up and decays down, which is kind of interesting. So what does that, why all this is useful to us? Well, it is useful to us because if we're looking at the hearing mechanism as a spectrum analyzer, which is nothing new, actually. Helmholtz put out the theory a long time ago. Fletcher in the 40s kind of organized it with experiments and theory, basically representing the hearing mechanism as a set of bandpass filters. He said independent from each other. Now we can discuss that, but anyhow. And the bandwidth of each bandpass filter was related not to frequency, not to log frequency. Sometimes you hear about the MEL, but actually to a distance in the cochlea, in the basilar membrane, which is basically where all the translation from movement of the air into movement of the fluid gets mapped into specific frequency. So that's related to a space in the cochlea. So he called these frequency intervals critical bandwidths, which are not proportional to the frequency itself, but actually proportional to a distance in the basilar membrane. So he organized all this. So logically, the first thing we want to do is, if we look at the sound, to look at it in the frequency domain. We have the perfect frame, not only to look at the energy of the signal, but also to apply psychoacoustic modeling in a way which is very in agreement to with the physical mechanism. So that's what we're doing, basically. We're looking at the signal, we're taking snapshots in time, and we're looking at the, I call it Fourier transform, the equivalent of the frequency content, and we decide how much masking is going to take place because of the principal components of the signal. And based on that, we're allocating our resources, our bits. So what happens? Here's what happens. Here we have a sound, what we call an audible signal here, because this is my masked threshold. So this is a little sound that, without the presence of a main masker, would have a little, masking curves. But at this point, it's irrelevant because the dominant masker is somewhere, at a higher frequency that partially masks this sound. We say it's audible because its energy is above the threshold, the mask threshold, and we call this the signal-to-mask ratio, SMR. So if we were to allocate bits without knowing anything about the signal, or at least nothing about the masking energy of the signal, we would say, well, we need as many bits as we need to cover, the whole energy. So if we apply the 60 B per bit rule, we're going to have a certain number of bits. What I'm telling you is actually that's not absolutely necessary. What you need to have is as many bits as necessary so that the resulting signal-to-noise ratio, again, simplified as 60 B per bit, is going to be bigger than the SMR. So the SNR has to be bigger than the SMR, or at least exactly the same. If it's bigger, then we have what we call coding margin. So if we made any mistakes in the calculation of our psychoacoustic model, then we are a little safer. We have something extra. If we're not able to allocate that many bits, then we have a signal-to-noise ratio which is less than the SMR. Then we are in a region where the quantization noise is going to be audible because it's going to be above the mask threshold. So this is kind of the simple idea behind perceptual audio coding. And basically, more or less, all the coders, certainly all the coders in the marketplace are exploiting these principles. So what I wanted to show you now, just to kind of let you touch it with your own ears, what does that mean? And I'm showing you a demonstration. It was actually concocted by my friends JJ, Jim Johnston, and Brandenburg when they were working at AT&T in the 90s. Because we had a lot of pushback. I mean, how can you, allocate so little bits, and how does that work? So they took a signal, and they allocated as many bits as necessary so that the quantization noise was always below the mask threshold, okay? So they kept the quality constant. They were not worried about data rates or anything. They just wanted the perfect quality for that particular signal. And after they did that, they measured the signal-to-noise ratio, which happened to be 13 dB, right? If you're using PCM, so the straight audio CD technology, that's equivalent of allocating about 2 bits per sample. So would you expect quantization noise to be audible? Yes, you would, because 2 bits is not that great, right? Signal-to-noise ratio of 13 bits, well, good luck with that. So I'm going to play, luckily. This is the original. This is the 13 dB signal where the quantization noise was shaped according to psychoacoustic principles. So we're here. How many of you heard a difference in between the, whatever, 90 dB or something and the 13 dB signal? I mean, yes? What did you hear, if I may ask? Sorry, I can't hear you. What? The beat sounded different? Thank you. What did he say? Okay, thank you.
2, 1,
I
here we
need
go.
some
The
ear
light
aids
beats.
here.
Oh.
Okay, so some people heard some differences. Again, this is not kind of a fair comparison because the noise has a lot of background noise, so maybe in a different environment you could hear some more, but anyhow. Right, but what if I have white noise? In other words, noise that is not shaped, it's like flat. And this is what we get at 13 dB signal to noise ratio. All right, so it's pretty clear that you have a constant hiss, basically. Shall I play the 3 samples again without my blabbing too much, or what's your preference? Yes? So this is the original. Um, 13 dB signal to noise ratio, but the quantization noise is shaped. And this is 13 dB signal to noise ratio, but the quantization noise is white. So 3 different signals, I guess, but just to make sure we're not cheating here, I'm going to play for you the difference in between the original and the shaped, and the original and the white noise 13 dB signal. So this is the shaped. So basically, if you can hear it, the quantization noise follows the spectral envelope of the signal, which is kind of interesting. And the white noise is more or less what we expect. It's just flat white noise. So this is where we stand. And I said, in this particular example, we kept the quality constant. In other words, if we needed more bit, we were allocating more bits. Most of the cases, you have a channel capacity, which is your limitation. So that's not the whole story. You have to do some optimization in between rate and distortion. So if you do that, you're going to get something like this. And I'm explaining to you and I'm showing. These are a bunch of coders that were tested in Canada at CRC at the end of the 90s. And at the time, we just finished the work on Ampeg AAC, and we wanted to see how that compared to the other existing coders. For example, in this line here, we have AC3, also known as Dolby Digital. PAC was a coder that was developed at AT&T, was briefly used in digital radio, but I don't think anyone uses that anymore. Here we have Ampeg Layer 2. How many of you have heard of Ampeg Layer 2? A few of you, great. When I'm giving this talk in the US, no one knows what Ampeg Layer 2 is, which is kind of interesting because it's used in set-top boxes more or less all over the place. At the time when we were working in Ampeg, I mean, one of the things I forgot to mention, in '88 was kind of the year where Ampeg started. And they started by addressing just the video. quickly realizing that video is not the whole story. In order to be meaningful, they needed audio. So at the second or third meeting, they started also inviting audio experts. But so a lot of the work in perceptual audio coding was done within the standardization bodies, especially within Ampeg. So Ampeg layer 2 was probably the first successful coder, and I'm saying the first because MP3 was just at the tail end of that, of the Ampeg standard work. And we all thought that was the winner. There was nothing that could actually change that. MP3 at the time was too complex. It was not implemented. Layer 2 had the digital audio broadcasting on their side. They were really ready to go in a sprint. However, for a series of things that happened, which if you talk to my colleague Karl-Heinz Brandenburg of FAG, says it was all planned, it was all marketing, but basically they had a leakage of the encoder in Australia, and at the time was when, at the end of the 1990, beginning of 2000, was when the internet was really picking up, and everyone thought that that was free, and everyone started using it, and it became a de facto standard for portable devices and internet applications. But that was a little bit of a chance. So MP3 is here with only one point, Ampeg layer 3. But let me describe what I'm showing you here. So on the x-axis, I have different data rates. The data rates go in between 64 kilobit per stereo signal, up to 192 kilobit per stereo signal. Now, just to make a comparison, for example, for the CD, at 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate, you have a data rate of 1.4 megabits per second. So, you know, it's kind of good compression here. And on the y-axis here, I have what I call the SDG, the subjective different grade. It goes in between 0 and -4, the SDG. The actual grading that the test subjects are asked to use is in between 1 and 5. And it's really important to understand how we define the quality in perceptual audio coders. Because as I just showed you, signal-to-noise ratio is not a good measurement. It's very misleading. You can have two completely different signals with the same signal-to-noise ratio. So how can we decide whether or not a perceptual audio coder is good or good enough for our applications? Any guesses? So you have to listen to it. And so there are different methodologies for listening to it, because we want not only to listen to it and get a sense of what it is, but we also want to reproduce the results, compare the results. So the first important methodology that was worked out in between experts was within the ITOR, and it's called BS, recommendation BS 1116. And that's really addressing systems which are very, very close to the region of transparency. What is the region of transparency? Basically, is a region where we cannot distinguish in between the original and the coded version. So we're implying that the test subjects are able to discern in between the two versions. And if that's not the case, then you give it a 5. So there are no difference, no perceptual difference. A 4 means that it's perceptible but not annoying. A 3 is slightly annoying, a 2 annoying, and a 1 is very annoying. You can't stand the thing, right? So if you see a scale like this, this is the SDG, so it's a difference in between 5 and, which is the coded version, and whatever grade you gave. For example, if you found that the signal you heard was perceptible but not annoying, you give it a 4.5, the SDG is going to be minus 0.5, okay? So, so here, if you see this scale, you probably are in the presence of systems which very, very high quality, which is not always the case. And so the BS 1116 with the impairment scale, we call this impairment scale, shows you that very, very high quality system. So, and here we have different data rates and different points for the systems. Of these coders, which ones do you think are the best performing? AAC, right. And why is that? Because not only is it sort of the highest quality, but it's also at the lowest data rate. According to his graph, At 128 kilobit per second per stereo signal, we have a quality which is pretty close to the region of transparency, which is the 0. The second one is AC3, but the data rate is actually much higher, 192, right? And then PAC seems to have kind of a vertical growth and works really well at 128. But if you increase the data rate, it goes up the quality, but not as much as you would expect. We call that kind of the sweet spot of the coder, where you get the most gain by increasing the data rate, and then it kind of flattens out. Right, then layer 2, obviously, it's not that great, especially if we can comparing apples to apples. For example, at 128, we are in the annoying region for layer 2 compared to AAC, which is certainly not annoying. And surprisingly at the time, because people were using MP3 at 128 or lower, my students, for example, the quality is not that great. If you increase the quality, layer 3 performs better, but at that data rate, I would not recommend you use it. So having said that, how does this sound? I want to play for you an example, which is AC3, also known as Dolby Digital. This was at the very, very beginning of the development, so in the 90s. And just to show you which type of artifacts we are typically introducing with perceptual audio coding. So what I'll do, I'm going to play first the original, and I have 3 pieces here. Susan Vega, which is a famous piece that was really giving us a hard time, especially at the beginning of the development of perceptual audio coding. The Dire Straits and the Beethoven the Fifth. And I'm going to show it at a data rate of 192 kilobit per second per stereo signal. So if we are considering a sampling rate of 48 kilohertz, that's the equivalent of 2 bits per PCM sample, right? So a compression ratio of 8 to 1. So I'm going to show you the signals. I'm going to play it through original, coded, and then the difference. So you kind of have a sense for which artifacts we are introducing.
I am sitting in the morning at the diner on the corner. I am waiting at the counter for the man to pour the coffee, and he fills it only halfway, and before I even argue, he is looking out the window at somebody coming in.
Coded version.
I am sitting in the morning at the diner on the corner. I am waiting at the counter for the man to pour the coffee, and he fills it only halfway, and before I even argue, he is looking out the window at somebody coming in.
And the difference. Okay, so that was Susan Vega. Let's listen to the Dire Straits. A coded version. The difference. And finally, the Beethoven Fifth. Coded version. understand the difference. Right. Okay. Any thoughts that I can hear? If you guys have a microphone. Yes. The high end. What about the transient when you have percussions? Yes. Right. So there's a lot of things that are going on, and mostly we're not going to be able to hear. So especially with the result, if I go back, let's see if I can do that. Yes. Especially with the result of AAC, we thought we were done. We reached what we thought like a 128, which is really good. We're done with perceptual audio coding. And guess what? Except we weren't, because, yes, we were done with what we call waveform coding. But what we started to do is we started parametrizing the sound. And that's where a technology called spectral band replication kind of came into play. It was originally applied to speech, and then around the 2000, we started applying it very successfully to audio coding. And the idea is that, if we code a signal, we're looking at the spectrum, right? And we started allocating bits. We're allocating bits at the low part of the spectrum. Typically, signals are sort of colored, so you're kind of a safe bet to allocate the bits first in the low part of the spectrum. And what happens if we're running out of bits? Well, you know what? We're going to low pass it, right? So the idea here is, what if we chop off right away the high part of the spectrum, we only code the low part of the spectrum, and we somewhat derive the higher part of the spectrum as a function of the lower part of the spectrum. And that's kind of the basic idea behind SBR, spectral band replication. So here you have the energy of the signal, and the dashed line here is a mask threshold, so the quantization noise can be below the dashed line. What we do is we kind of chop off basically the higher part of the spectrum. We take the lower part of the spectrum and transpose it to the higher part of the spectrum, and we only send sort of the envelope information. So we reshape this guy here based on the envelope of the lower part of the spectrum. So by doing that, we're saving a ton of data, and we have actually surprisingly very good results. Now, this technology, it was originally applied to AAC+, which is also known as high efficiency AAC, but also was applied to MP3 Pro. I don't know if any of you heard the term or used it, but this similar technology is actually currently used in EAC3, enhanced AC3, also known as Dolby Digital Plus. AC4, Ampeg D, USAC, which is kind of one of the newest coding schemes, still based on, at least partially, on the frequency analysis of the signal. USAC stands for Unified Speech and Audio Coding, and the most current one, which is Ampeg H, which is basically USAC improved. So in a way, you can think that there is a direct, you can see that there is a direct line in between Ampeg AAC, USAC, and Ampeg H. AC3 had a slightly different development. But before I move forward, I would like to play an example for you and ask you if you actually can hear the difference. So this is not a formal test, so it's not, in a way, not really fair. But what I would like to do is play the original and then 3 signals. And I'm going to mix and match the coded version and the original. And I'm asking you to detect which is which. So if you have a piece of paper or something and you want to write which you think it is. Just for your information, this is AAC plus, so AAC plus spectral band replication at 48 kilobit per second stereo signal. So before we saw AC3 at 192, this is 48. So we have, before we had a 8-to-1 compression ratio, now we have a 32-to-1 compression ratio. So very, very drastic. Okay, well, let me try and see what happens. So this is the original, the trumpet. So this, we don't know what it is. You get to decide if any of these signals are the original or the coded version. So this is signal number 3. This here. And this is signal number 4. Shall we go on? Or you guys are already done? Shall we do one more? Okay. So for speech, original.
In the course of a December tour in Yorkshire, I rode for a long distance in one of the public coaches on the day preceding Christmas.
Signal 1.
In the course of a December tour in Yorkshire, I rode for a long distance in one of the public coaches on the day preceding Christmas.
Next signal.
In the course of a December tour in Yorkshire, I rode for a long distance in one of the public coaches on the day preceding Christmas.
And the last one there.
In the course of a December tour in Yorkshire, I rode for a long distance in one of the public coaches on the day preceding Christmas.
Yes? One more? Or shall we move on? Do we have enough time? Yeah? All right. So let's play the ABBA. All right. Next. And the very last signal here. So, what do you think? Could you hear it? 3? Okay, now let's put out the answer to it. Of course, the first signal was always the original. For the trumpet, the signal 2 and signal 3 were the coded version, and the last one was the original. For the speech, we had original, coded. And for the ABBA, it was original, coded, original. Any of you got it all correct? No. You did. Congratulations. We should give him a Juice Award later on. Yeah. I find the difference pretty subtle. Of course, this is not what we call critical material. Part of the work that goes into a BBS 1116 test is the selection of the critical material. We have to have at least 1 or 2, they say 1.5, but really 2, at least 2 critical material per codec that we're testing. Otherwise, we're not really identifying the worst case scenario, because that's really what we're trying to do with the tests. So I'm going to show you here how do the different versions of AAC compare to each other. Again, on the x-axis, I have different data rate in between 0 and 128 kilobit per stereo signal. And on the y-axis, now I have a different scale, which is the quality scale, which is not the same as the impairment scale. Here, we're testing signal of, quote unquote, medium quality. So if you see this scale, it's typically a Musher test, goes in between 0 and 100. And although it gives a good indication of where the codec stand, or the codecs stand, is not considered the most strict, most demanding test. But nevertheless, what you can see here, first of all, we have the AAC, the brown curve here. And these are collecting data from different tests and different venues. You can see that if we really want to be in the region of transparency, we still go back to waveform coding to AAC at 128 kilobit per stereo signal. But if we decrease the data rate for AAC, below 96, the quality deteriorates quite quickly. So we're better off below 96 kilobit per second. We're better off using the parameterization of the high frequencies that I just showed to you, and that's high efficiency AAC or AAC plus. So basically, we can decrease the data rate as low as 48 and still have, what we call almost excellent quality, in between 80 and 100. Now, I have another curve here, which is the high efficiency AAC version 2, where in addition to parameterizing the frequency content of the signal, we also parameterizing the stereo information. So version 2 also does parameterization of binaural cues, in which case we can go even a lower data rate. So again, the lowest the data rate, the more parameterization, but if you want transparency, go back to waveform coding at a relatively high data rate. How does this compare to, for example, a multi-channel format? Because we're all using, or we're supposed to be using more than stereo channels. I don't know about your practice, but for consumer electronics, having a system which is, surround 5.1 channels, it's always a good point. It's always like, a point to sell more products. And here I have DTS, Dolby Digital, AAC, high efficiency AAC, and this is a high efficiency AAC version 2 with a stereo binaural parameterization. So again, AAC at high enough data rate is still performing the best. Dolby Digital is pretty good. DTS is pretty good, but at the highest data rates. When we start going lower, we definitely like to switch, at the high efficiency AAC or high efficiency AAC with the surround binaural cue parameterized. So, if you're looking at this graph, you have pretty impressive points because here at 160 per 5.1 channels, you have what we call excellent quality. So not bad. So again, so we're done, right? Do we still need compression? And, guess what the answer is? People are still working on compression, believe it or not. I just want to go back and talk about 3D sound and how it sort of all started. And I'm showing to you here the concept of this spherical concert hall, which was introduced by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in the 70s. In fact, he went more than just having a theoretical concept. He actually implemented with the help of the University of Berlin, Technical University of Berlin, and did this installation in Kyoto and kept it for 6 months. They had over 1 million visitors. Basically, they had 50 loudspeakers arranged in a sphere, and they had a number of compositions for that specific space. And so here we started kind of, migrating from, the 2 channels of even the 5.1 channels, which is basically a flat type of surround. I don't know if you are familiar with the name 5.1. The 0.1 refers to the loudspeaker that is completely dedicated to the low frequencies. So 0.1 means 10% of the bandwidth. So 200 hertz or below, if 20 kilohertz is the max we can hear. And then the other 5 channels, you have the center channel, left, right, left surround, and right surround. Why do we have the center channel? To me, as a musician, was always a little bit of a puzzle, because we can always reconstruct the center channel as a phantom image. We inherited this format from the cinema practice. We absolutely need the center channel, otherwise we muck up the dialogue. We cannot do that. But anyhow, it became a de facto standard for surround sound, but we want to go more than surround. We want the 3D sound. And here where we are, in terms of standardization, we are at 22.2 channels. In fact, Ampeg, the latest Ampeg H standard, allows for this type of configuration. How do we get there? Well, we have, first of all, 3 layers. So the 5.1 was only middle layer, and you only had the center, the right, the left, and 2 surround channels. Here you have additional surround channels here, additional speakers in between the left and the right channel, so it's kind of in the middle, and they say that it helps for panning, for ambience, so it's really helpful to have these middle channels. And then we have the back channel, which is, to me, it's really important because we cannot phantom imaging in the back, so that's really important. So the total here is, if you look, can read this slide, is we have 10 channels, where before we only had 5.1. But that's not the whole story. We have a lower layer, the bottom layer, and the idea is that we use the bottom layer for sounds like river or water, something which is kind of lower than we want to reproduce. And we have left, right, center, plus the two low LFE, low frequency effect or low frequency enhancement channels, 1 and 2. Those are in the bottom layer. And plus, we have the top layer. And in the top layer, we have actually 9 channels, 3 in the front, 3 in the back, 2 at the side, plus the very top, on top of your head. So is this realistic? Is anyone using it? I'm actually asking you this question. But it seems like people at NHK who introduced this format are very adamant that this is the future of audio. This is where we're going to go. What happens, for example, in ultra high definition television, we use a subset of the speakers. Typically, the configuration, this was recently standardized by ATSC 3.0, so the ultra high HDTV in the US. So you have 7.1 speaker in the middle layer, what we call the middle layer. So this is the center channel, left, right, the 2 surround channels on the right and 2 surround channels on the left, plus the subwoofer. But in addition, we have 4 speakers at the top. Okay, so that gives you more of the 3D environment. And how does that compare? Here are some test results that were done at ITUR in conjunction with the ITUR work. So what we have here, again, we have the scale in between 20 and 100. And there are 4 different positions, actually 3 plus the average, where the listener were located. The square is the center, which you expect to have the best type of spatial image. A little bit off the right and a little bit off the left, and this is the average. So if instead of 22.2, which is kind of the hidden reference, we only use 4 top and nothing in the bottom and none of the extra loudspeakers, we have a little bit of a decreased directional quality. Notice also where the square, which is the central position, seems to be much more privileged. If we have only 3, so this would be like the equivalent of 7.1 plus 4, 11.1. This is like 10.1, more or less, similar results. Only 2, you definitely decrease. But if you're looking at a 7.1, so just the middle layer, the perception of directional quality is actually much, much lower. So with this data, you may argue that yes, we probably should consider having, if we want a 3D experience, we probably should consider using at least 11.1 or 10.1 loudspeakers. Yes, 3 minutes, oh my goodness. All right, so I'm gonna skip this one. This is actually BS1116 test for Ampeg Edge, the 3D audio. And notice that this was a 768 kilobit per second, but for either 22.2 or 11.1 channels. So we're back, pretty close to transparencies, but much higher data rate than for, normal waveform coding. So where are we going, really? We're going to higher and higher compressions. I showed you that with waveform coding, we actually have what we call high-quality broadcast emission quality at 64 kilobit per equivalent channel, or 128 per stereo channels. Lower data rates can work out very well with excellent quality as per Mashra tests, and that's where we're using parametrization of the signal. But we want to use more channels, so how do we deal with that? Well, we still have to use some compression, but that's not the whole story. We're changing the whole idea of production and the whole chain is slightly changed in that we don't deal only with what we call traditionally channels, but we also consider object coding. So we define a sound object and high order ambisonic coding. The rendering is not fixed anymore. We have multiple possibilities, and we can render with more or less speakers, but we have to be able to translate that into metadata. So we have a lot of work going on in metadata. We have a lot of work going into the HRTF, head-related transfer function, personalization, so listening through headphones, but still having the immersive experience, and a lot of interactivity that could go on, right? So how do we do that? We do that by describing audio scenes and metadata. So we're shifting more and more from the pure content to content with description of what we're doing and how we're going to be rendering it. And finally, this is quite important. A lot of people are working on this, although Ampeg is addressing more the compression side of it. A lot of companies like Facebook, et cetera, are working on the 6DOF, the 6th degree of freedom. So in other words, not only you want the 3D with a sweet spot, you want to be able to walk around the space and make sure you have like this immersive type of situation. And that kind of changes all the paradigms in that, what is the reference there? How do you test? And so there are a lot of questions that are going on right now as we speak in Ampeg, addressing what we call Ampeg-I, Ampeg immersive. So yeah, so this is basically we're kind of moving, and the idea is like using MRI and having Siri saying, please play Tom's Diner without Zan voice, and in an ambience, it is not this room, but a different room where I really want to hear certain things more than others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, we have no limits. And the only thing I think we need to be careful as engineers, as citizens, is we need to look into policies and privacy issues and all this. And I think it's not someone else's responsibility. At the end of the day, it's us that are going to be empowering, with new technology, and we need to keep the control on certain, I think, human rights. But anyhow. So basically what I noticed, and this is kind of looking forward, really is a shift from pure entertainment content creation to more and more embedded data. So now the consumers are also the creators. They create, share, and access the data on a device-neutral basis. In other words, we don't have a specific audio signal. We have our phones or something equivalent to our phones that allow us to basically do all this in one platform. That's what I think we're doing. We can reuse the technology across industries. For example, the work of Ampeg now is actually going to be applied to reading of the genomes, like DNA, different readings, reducing the data rate with lossless compression and metadata. So it's kind of interesting. And again, I can't emphasize more that policy and privacy are really, really important if we're going to move ahead at this speed and encompassing all these things. So this is all I wanted to say. I really thank you for staying so late, and it was great being here. Thank you.
Well, Marina came all the way from San Francisco area for this, so I think we should allow a bit of time for a couple of questions.
If you have any.
Oh, okay. Want to hear?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was really great. One question is, what kind of psychoacoustic spatial methods do you use in your compression for spatial audio, 3D audio? Do you use the models for the 2D or the masking, or do you apply psychoacoustic effects from localization and?
The latter, the psychoacoustic effects from localization. In addition to the masking, the traditional, what I call traditional frequency masking, you're also looking at other, spatial attribute of sounds like interval delays, time delay, intensity difference in between the two pinne, any type of, if you're doing HRT, any type of filtering that takes place in the pinna, because that gives you the elevation. Sorry?
The precedence effect.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So you're kind of merging all that with the impulse response, binaural impulse response of the rooms, and you kind of do a convolution of that and the coded signal, like, you know, in the traditional way. So all that comes into play. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Going back to the example of the AAC 192 kilobit, this seems to be the best quality if you want to be, if you are looking for transparency.
The AC3, the Dolby Digital, or the AAC? The AAC, okay.
So,
so this was AAC plus. I don't have an example for AAC, but yes, go ahead.
no, what I want to say is, what's the status of improving the quality by maintaining high bit rates instead of trying to lower the bit rate again?
Yeah, very good question, because I'm a fan of keeping the data rate correct so that you don't hear too many artifacts. In other words, I think it's safe if you're using iTunes or if you're using you know, any system that actually uses AAC to keep it at high data rates or higher than what people may suggest you do. Especially for MP3, you definitely want to be more than 128 kilobit per second. So I think the development we had during these years, so you see going from Ampeg layer 2 to layer 3 to AC3 to AAC, we understood better and better both the psychoacoustic modeling, and also we had so many advances in DSP and computer power availability. Like, for example, I was working at Dolby Laboratories. We were working on AC3, Dolby Digital, but one of the things we cannot budge was the size of our blocks, because memory at the time was really expensive. So we were looking at applications in high definition television. That was kind of the main drive at the time. AC3 was being adopted by ATSC. And so we had a certain block size, which I felt as a scientist, as a technician, or whatever you want me to call me, was not good enough to represent the signal correctly. So when we started developing AAC, we kind of broke the coder in two, you know, segments. And for each segment, we optimized what we felt was right to do. And we adopted it. In spite of the pushback from our bosses or pushback from other people, we decided that was the way, and we did. And I think really AAC reached kind of the peak for waveform coding. Having said that, I will not recommend you use it below 128 kilobit per second per stereo signal. That's why, for example, high efficiency AAC, which is that plus SPR, a parameterization, is basically a de facto standard in mobile applications, because you can go at lower data rate, but the quality at lower data rate is actually better than AAC. So if your medium constraint is in this area here, don't use AAC, use high efficiency AAC. And by the way, Dolby is licensing both now, Dolby Digital Plus, and high efficiency AAC and ISC via licensing. They acquired the rights. So the business is actually really very lucrative. We're talking about tens of billions in licensing, which has a gross margin of over 90%, almost 100%. So it's really, you know, it really paid off for Dolby to do early investment in this technology.
One last question. Daniel over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to see quantitative data about the perception. So that was very interesting. Since you spoke of the very early codecs, so I was missing one, which was A-Track.
Oh, yes, very good point. A-Track was developed, I'm going to move out of the spotlight for a little second, if you don't mind. A-Track was developed by Sony, and I don't know how many of you have ever used the Sony Mini Disc, which I think is a beautiful product. Yes, thank you. Oh, you're so good. Right, so Sony was using a similar approach to AAC or AC3 in that it's doing a frequency analysis of the signal on a block-by-block basis. And in addition, it sort of uses kind of gain control for temporal quantization noise. One of the things which is a drawback for most of the codecs is the fact that we want to use long blocks to have max frequency resolution so we can really look at the signal and understand what we can do or cannot do. But at the same time, when we have transient, when you have a drum, when you have a castanet, we want sure blocks because we want more time resolution, right? We cannot have both at the same time. So A-Track was addressing that by doing some kind of gain changes at the very forefront of the quantization scheme. Good scheme, not as powerful as AAC. So if you're using at 192 kilobit per second per channel, so, relatively higher data rate, it was excellent, yes.
Do you know, is this technology used in any current
Not that I know of, no. I mean, if
vanished?
you're looking at the marketplace, you're looking at, broadcasting is Dolby Digital and Dolby Digital Plus nowadays, which is basically Dolby Digital with the extension of the SPR extension. High efficiency AAC or AAC, and those are kind of the, commercially, they're used in the Mac OS, and in Dolby Digital Plus is also used in Microsoft operating system. So, I mean, they're basically kind of, took the market. And, there are other schemes that, in my mind, were really good quality-wise. Another scheme that was developed by Sony was speech coding based on sinusoidal modeling and psychoacoustic modeling. That was really, really excellent at 2 kilobit per second. But it never took off, and I don't know why. So there is a question of quality, luck, marketing, powerful reaching of, and then people start using it, and they get really familiar with it and comfortable from the, from the technology point of view. It's very difficult to migrate.
Right, thank you very much. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you. You guys are